Hi everyone. I'm Robert Silva. I born and grown up in a country called Sri Lanka. We have experienced 30 years or 3 decades of war. In my generation, I first experienced the first experience that I've gone through, traumatic experience, is the communal riots happened in 1983. And then 89, we had similar rights, but it's not communal. Soon after my higher studies, then 2005, the severe tsunami, which affected and more than 50,000 people died within few minutes. And during that time, we were able to support the tsunami victims. But at that time, I didn't know much about trauma and trauma support or anything, but we directly worked with these traumatized people. With my experience working with them, it was a blessing that we got professionals who came from Australia, Dr. Graham and Dr. Clifford and some others, and they came and did training, and that's the turning point in my journey to work with people who affected by crisis and trauma. But after going through that experience, I was able to learn more on counseling. I did my master's in counseling in Australia, Excelsior University. It's a Christian college. And one of my professor, Dr. Graham Barker, and few others, and Dr. Paula Davis also. I take this time to thank the impact that I got through Dr. Graham and then later Dr. Paula Davis, who came to Sri Lanka to work with me since 2011 to 2019. We have done so much of trauma counseling among post-war victims. It's both groups. There's army personnels as well as the civilians. Civilians, we had both groups. These people who lived in the armed group side and the people who were affected by the fightings. That's Sinhala community and the Tamil community also. And it's very important to know a person who went through trauma, who experienced crisis and trauma. The biggest thing is they don't know how to come out or don't know where they are stuck. This is very clearly we saw in the time that we have worked in the north and east and south in Sri Lanka. Especially during the tsunami time, we were really worked with them. But initially, we did a lot of social work, providing them initial supports. Later, we started to do trauma work among them 2005. When you look at this picture, it is very clearly explaining, easy, a person who gone through or a person who impacted by trauma, how it's feel and how is his lifestyle. When you look at from outside, you know the path where to come out, but person who is stuck inside doesn't know how to come, especially they don't have the mental capacity or the way how to come out of this situation. Especially when a person gone through experienced trauma, the initially short-term we call, the shock and denial. And long-term reactions include a lot of things, unprotected emotions, flashback, and things and all. We are going to talk more on it. But unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, people who went through this war experience, it's not a short term, it was continuously so many years. They see bombs, they saw people who are dying in front of them, they want to displace and they cross borders, and then they come to an area which controlled by arm, and that's a safe area, but in their mind it's not safe area and things and all. And then once they resettled only, we went back to work with them. But what they go day-to-day things, they think it's normal, but it's not normal when you look at in a perspective of PTSD. Today, I have to give a small example. In 2012, we had a camp for young teenagers and young people. There were 150 young people. And when I organized this camp, purely it's a reconciliation camp, post-traumatic experience Tamil-speaking community, and the post-traumatic stress experienced single-speaking community, young people. Both of us there. There was a 4-day camp, 3 nights, 4 days. The third night, we had a very nice environment. But unfortunately, the campfire time, they put some fire lightnings. And when the lightning fireworks happens, the girls and boys who came from the post-war area, they fell down and slept on the floor, the ground. And simple reason is the fireworks sound, boom, that triggered them, their past wartime bombing, and that we call hyper alertness. And lot of symptoms were there, like body part tension, nausea, dizziness, and lot of heartbeat increase. But when we observed, we saw that they are not making decisions very clearly. That very confusion, difficult to make decisions. They example, during the wartime, some of them got into marriage because of escaping from the situation, and because of they are not decisions are not very wiseful. They quickly make decisions, and pattern is very disoriented. Most of them, they said, they can't have long time sleep or good night sleep because they're disturbed by nightmares, which not related to their day-to-day life. It was seen in their life. Not only that, they keep hope, what's going on after. They just want to do, and their personal relationship, their trusting each other was not very healthy. And I want to tell you that comparing to Westerns and Asians, they don't know how to express their emotional symptoms. They don't know how to verbalize. And when you ask, they normally say, everything is okay. Oh, fine. No, it's okay. It's the reality. We have survived. But they are not normal. The very important one I have observed during post-war traumatic counseling time, we did a lot of group and individual also. Mood swing was very common. They every time, say some complaint, irritating. It's not nice. It's not enough or something. They never satisfied. It was not there before the war. I think that some of them they never compare and say, but it was there. If there are things not happen where they want, this is not only disappointment. They get angry. I saw more tendency of getting into angry and violence. That is part of their behavior we saw. Because it is easily go other way also. Violence happens, but someone come and mediating. They cool down by quickly, but they feel guilty, the behavior that they happen. Some of them, it's lost weight, or they are lost of appetite, or things we saw, but not everyone. There were other, behaviors also. Very common one was substance abuse. That substance abuse was very common, especially local alcohol. And recent past, we saw a lot of younger people who went through trauma when their childhood, and now they are more and more on addiction to cannabis and drugs and etc. And I would say I have observed, comparing other part of Sri Lanka and the people who gone through this post-war area, there are more relationship issues also I would see in their day-to-day life. Effect of unresolved trauma, it's like a wave. It start one place, but you can see it's continuing. It's a cycle. It's a destructive outcome. With all these things, I think a country who experienced 30 years war, and we had a responsibility to do healing to our nation. And I thank God that God given me opportunity to study under a Christian counseling university or a college, and especially under people who really committed to Bible and psychology, integrated counseling. And today I was really blessed to do this seminar with my professor, one of my mentor, Dr. Paula Davis and Barry Davis. They were with me since 2011. We worked so much of traumatic people, teachers, pastors, lay workers, lay leaders, community members, civilians, one-to-one, group counseling, and lot. And one thing initially we identified all the books that we have read, and we used that some of the exercise techniques, can't implement in their context because they don't know how to express their feelings, their disturbance, or communicate. But we found the group therapy was one of the best method that we have used among PTSD people in the north and south and east part of Sri Lanka. And today I requested my professor, Dr. Paula Davis, to bring this information and the teaching part. And I would like to hand over to Dr. Paula Davis to continue the session from now itself.
Hi, my name is Paula Davis and I'm in Sydney, Australia. I wish I could be with you wherever you are, but I want you to know that I'm there in spirit. So today we're going to talk about trauma, and we're going to talk about some of the things that I learned from my doctoral research about the transferability of Western trauma concepts to collective societies. So let's start with what is trauma. So Western writers define psychological trauma as a turning point that is very disrupting in terms of personality change, illness, or potential mental health problems. In 2004, when I first visited war-torn Uganda, the cultural transferability of the trauma program that I was offering was not initially known by me. And years later, when I visited post-war Sri Lanka, I kind of learned by observation that Sri Lanka embraced a different cultural value system to my own. And I began to think that maybe the therapeutic approaches and tools of counselling that underpinned Western trauma recovery might not meet the needs of counsellors in the Southeast Asian context. Let me get my notes here. There we go. So we're talking about collective versus individualistic societies. And it's well known that in Southeast Asia, the concept of the family unit comprises the extended family, members such as grandparents, uncles, aunties, and cousins. So it's about interdependence within the extended family. And as well as that, social harmony is esteemed and valued, as distinct from the Western concept of personal independence and the centrality of the nuclear family. Even though the extended family may be important to Westerners, it's largely around the concept of the nuclear family as a social unit that is important, and the ties between other family members are quite loose, and everyone is expected to look after their immediate family. So we're talking about collectivism versus individualism. And what I found in my research about trauma symptoms is that the physical symptoms are very similar across the world. So those who face continual trauma in the collective society are more susceptible to shifts in personality, and emotional stress is expressed in physical reactions. So people would say, I've got a stomach ache or I've got a headache. In my society, the term PTSD is coined, or post-traumatic stress disorder is defined by 3 core symptoms: the avoidance of traumatic reminders, so I won't visit the place where the trauma happened because I'm too scared to; the re-experiencing of the event, so I have lots of flashbacks about the event that happened, the traumatic event; and feelings of threat. It's like the event is happening in the present. And this post-traumatic stress disorder results in difficulty in functioning. In your culture, it functions within a web of spiritual beliefs and practices, social networks, and reciprocity. Notions of trauma are tied to this web, and this web is fractured by collective trauma. In my society, notions of trauma are tied to events that meet the criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD. So the difference is that it's very individual in my society. Trauma is very individual, whereas in your society, it's very collective. It affects everybody in your web of relationships. Now, this looks a bit, a lot of information, but let me just tell you some things about daily stresses, because this was the major difference that I found. In collective cultures, the ability to perform socially imposed roles in the family functions to preserve social harmony. When I worked in African countries, I found that there was very much gender distinction in roles: who dug in the garden, who prepared meals, who got the firewood, etc., who did the cooking. And it's similar in the South Asian context, in that meaning and identity are attributed to performance of that role. And if severe trauma happens, like in Sri Lanka, there was a 30-year war, so that trauma stop people from functioning in their relationships and their socially assigned roles within the extended family. And that failure to be able to perform their role was a greater trauma than what was happening inside them. So the society sort of shapes how we operate, and there's patterns that developed. And in South Asian culture, mental disorders are highly stigmatized. So a traumatized person has to suppress and deny their personal needs, their goals, their aspirations, their work plans, and they give precedence to the broader collective. And the impact of collective trauma is experienced communally rather than individually. In other words, trauma reactions represented disruption to the social and moral order of society. In individual societies like mine, an individual's an autonomous decision maker and makes their own meaning. So they don't have to ask anyone else when they want to make a decision about their lives. It's very internal. And in terms of trauma, individuals need to develop skills in changing their thinking patterns and learning more effective coping skills for trauma. And meaning is tied to one's own attitudes and goals and values, and self-sufficiency is valued. So the responsibility for managing traumatic stress lies with the individual. And there's a disease model in the West. In other words, there's internal disease, an internal disorder if you don't handle trauma well. But also survivors do better if they emotionally ventilate and share their experiences. So in the West, suffering is more individual and it's more in terms of their thinking patterns. This is important, and probably this is the most important thing, and we'll go on to discuss how we might deal with this. In terms of self-disclosure, in collective societies, those who self-disclose or display their symptoms, for instance, if they are walking down the street and they suddenly start crying or they can't perform their duties, they are seen as weak or emotionally undisciplined. And this discomfort with self-disclosure, I can't tell you about my trauma. I can't tell you about my trauma because I'm going to be stigmatized. I'm going to be marginalized. That sort of discomfort with self-disclosure is expressed in fears of confidentiality, safety, and trust. When I was in Sri Lanka, I had people come up to me and say, please don't tell anybody, especially my pastor. It's almost like if they are told it's going to be in the newspaper the next day. So this reinforces the shame and hiddenness of what's going on for someone who's dealing with trauma. The ideal of social harmony leads to a sense of identity and belonging in collective societies, and it works really well in times of peace. But in the aftermath of war or severe trauma, the need for social harmony leads to, I can't tell you about what's happening for me. And so that leads to a sense of isolation. And so you don't get the support of close relationships that you need in terms of trauma recovery. One theorist said it's not what happens to you, but into whose arms you can fall. And that's not available in collective societies often. And the shame of exposure, if I tell you about my symptoms, serves to regulate any emotional displays of trauma distress. So I'm not going to show you because there's shame attached to it, and the shame makes me want to hide. So again, you don't get the nurturing support that you so desperately need. It's different in my society in that vulnerability and emotional disclosure is encouraged, and it often results in personal growth, a reduction in symptoms, and a decrease in distress. In that way, it contributes to trauma recovery as it helps the person to identify and understand and better manage their physical and emotional trauma symptoms. Social behaviour in the West is dictated by the attitudes and preferences of individuals. So independence is highly valued, and being dependent on others is often considered shameful or embarrassing. So it's the opposite to collectivism. Self-reliance and individual rights take precedence. And there's a belief that people should be able to solve their own problems. And they don't have to rely on assistance. But again, if you can't ask for help, you don't get the support that you need. And when I was in Sri Lanka, and we were doing a trauma recovery program, I found that it was best to work with couples, because when we worked with individuals, they wanted to take what they learnt back into the family. But I also learnt that when a safe place was created for the counselees, and I used therapeutic tools of counselling, which I will talk about a bit later. And when I used them in a safe and non-judgmental environment, people opened up, and it greatly assisted them in overcoming the norms of culture, this emotional discipline, shame, and personal hiddenness that preserves social harmony. And many reported that experiencing self-disclosure and being able to share their trauma stories where they could be vulnerable, when it was encouraged, they were able to actually break their silence regarding their traumatic experiences, and they got relief and healing. And it enabled them to actually cognitively process their trauma and receive the support that they needed. And when this was done in the couple space, the vulnerability of self-disclosure kind of lessened their shame, and it allowed each person to move from personal hiddenness to closeness in their relationships. And they also realized that they weren't alone. So in terms of our counsellors' vulnerability and emotional disclosure, I found that when it was facilitated in a safe environment, led to personal growth, and their symptoms were reduced and it decreased their distress. Okay, there's a picture of a burning building. And trauma is a bit like that. As you're sitting with someone and as a counsellor, you see a house burning down metaphorically, and you know that someone is trapped inside. And compassion for the trauma, for that person, the traumatized, is for you to go into that house, that burning house. But you know, if you go into that burning house without a plan, neither of you are going to survive. So you better have a floor plan to know your way out of the burning house. So let's look at what trauma is and how we as counsellors might be helpful to our clients to get them out of the burning house. And I've already said a big part of recovery is safety. So several really compelling studies have presented on how the effectiveness of counselling relies heavily on the therapeutic relationship. So who provides the therapy is much more important in terms of success than the approach you use or the tools that you use. So it's really important for you to be able to create a safe environment in terms of your relationship with your counsellee, that they will be able to risk sharing their stories. And then they in turn can take that safety into their communities. This is a great quote. At the moment of trauma, the victim is rendered helpless by overwhelming force. Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. So in normal life, this is how a healthy person maintains a sense of safety in the world. So the healthy person's at the middle of that circle. Around them are close friends, close family, then the extended family and other friends, then the church, the local community, their peers, the extended family. And surrounding all of this is God, their relationship with God, that gives them stability. Trauma shatters our sense of safety in the world. It's like throwing it up and it all falls down and we don't know where it's landed. That's what it feels like. And I want to talk for a minute about how the brain responds to trauma. You can see there that for this presentation that there are three parts of the brain, or three brains, if you like. The thinking brain, or the cerebral cortex, or the executive state, if you like, the prefrontal cortex, is largely responsible for how we code and store information that eventually becomes a memory. If you go down the bottom, the brainstem is the survival brain, and it's the seat of action. In the middle there is the emotional brain. It's called the limbic system or the feeling brain. And this brain stores highly charged emotional memories, both positive and negative. The feeling brain remembers the feel of the events, not the facts, and it attaches a fearful emotion to memory. Let me tell you how this works. And that's my crazy family up in the left-hand corner there. When a memory is linked with strong emotion, the feeling brain, which is actually the alarm system of the brain. So when there's a threat, the alarm goes off and there's fear, there's anxiety, there's anger, or there can be pleasure. So this alarm system goes off, it's activated, and it becomes an emotional memory. So in traumatic events, like a car accident or watching your house burn down or abuse by a parent or parents fighting, the emotional component of the memory is stored in the deep limbic system of the brain, the feeling brain. And on the other hand, if an event is pleasurable, like having a new baby, those emotional memories are stored here as well. And what happens through life is it's the total experience of our emotional memories that's responsible in part for the emotional tone of our mind. So when we are sad, we're likely to interpret an event that might be quite neutral through a negative lens. Or if our total experience is pleasurable and good, when we are sad, we're likely to interpret neutral events through that lens, a positive lens. So the more stable, positive experiences we have, the more positive we're likely to feel. And the more that we have trauma in our lives, the more that we're emotionally set in a negative way. How the amygdala hijacks the brain. So the feeling brain hijacks the whole of the brain. So what happens if you see a snake? Well, fear happens for me. Our senses receive the input. We can hear it hissing. We smell it. We see it. It goes into a part of the brain called the thalamus that acts as a controller that sends it up to the thinking brain for processing, whether you're in danger or not. But before the thinking brain can respond, the feeling brain perceives the threat. So the survival brain then kicks in and releases these neurochemicals into your body so that you can remove yourself and run away from the danger. For instance, if you're being chased by a lion, God forbid, and you are wearing a heavy backpack, what's the best way to survive? Throw away the backpack. So your thinking brain is like the backpack. When you're in trouble, it's not needed to survive, so you throw it off and run. We don't learn in the middle of a crisis. We need safety and space and time to reflect to be able to learn from it. So in crisis, the feeling brain gets scared and says, run, but it takes pictures so that when we get to a safe place, the whole person starts to think it's not okay for the person to curl up under a tree and keep running. And when we're safe, all three brains work at the same time. However, in trauma, the pictures get stuck. So in severe trauma, there's a very strong dominant feeling brain. And traumatic memories lack words and context because it's all encoded in feelings. But they are fixed in the form of vivid sensations and images that give our memory a sort of a heightened reality. And the pictures are sent up to the thinking brain to make sense of, but there's no response. And when you think about horror that happens, we don't want to think about it. It's not safe. And so we don't turn the switch to the thinking brain back on. When we survive a really scary situation, we all have pictures that come back. We avoid going to the place where it happened. We have nightmares, and this is the body's way of processing. The problem is when it doesn't stop and you don't get to process. So what happens to the brain during crisis and trauma? Too many neurochemicals may change the brain chemistry, resulting in a deficit in memory and damage to the brain structure. Healing actually involves waking up the thinking brain to make more sense of what happened. And I'll tell you how to do that in a minute. But we have to make it safe so that the pictures can come back a little bit at a time, so the survivor's not drowned in it and they don't think that they're going crazy. So we've got to teach our counsellors to break the cycle through safety and emotional containment strategies. And this is a critical element in healing, and it affords the survivor some control over the uncontrollability of bodily reactions. So if you broke your leg, what would be good? You would sit and you would rest. You wouldn't walk on it. So after trauma, the person needs rest. Something's broken. So if we try to make the person talk before they're ready, it's like making a person walk on their broken leg before it's safe to do so. So here are some tools to facilitate self-disclosure and to wake up the thinking brain. And I'm just going to focus on 4 of them quickly. Psychoeducation, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, positive psychological therapeutic approaches, and narrative therapy. Let's talk about psychoeducation. This is a great one when you are talking to a traumatized person. Ask them to put up their hand, and on each finger, create a list of people that they can call upon when they are really traumatized or having flashbacks or are distressed. And also what coping practices and skills can they do when they're really distressed? One of our primary values in duty of care is to make sure that people feel safe and that their distressing day-to-day symptoms are under control so that they can function. So psychoeducation tools are designed for the first stage of trauma intervention. So what we're going to do is educate and normalize troubling trauma symptoms. And we're going to help survivors and their families understand how their physical and emotional and cognitive symptoms are due to trauma, and that unrecognized trauma symptoms can lead to significant problems. So the counsellor gives information and helps the survivor integrate this new information into their being. Psychoeducation has a very strong evidence base. In other words, it works across the globe, and it's one of the most effective trauma recovery tools. It's relatively inexpensive and quite easy to use. But rather than being a standalone intervention, it's best used in a combination of other therapeutic approaches. One tool that I really love is by Janina Fisher, and it's a flip chart, and it's called The Living Legacy of Trauma. And it is available online, or you can find some good resources online that educate about what happens in the brain and the body and the emotions in terms of trauma. The tool talks about the neurobiological and the psychological effects of trauma and the physiological effects of trauma. And it normalizes ongoing difficulties with the inability to regulate your emotions and the inability to function well in day-to-day life. The second one I want to talk about is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And I realize I'm going through these very quickly. Excuse me, but some of you may be able to go to the internet and find out about these things that you can make them your own. So trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy combines trauma-sensitive interventions with cognitive behavioral therapy, and the psychoeducation that we, that we just talked about is a core component of it. So initially, the focus of this approach was on traumatized children who'd experienced sexual abuse, but it's now found to be a very effective therapy for adults as well. So it works with a person's thoughts and beliefs and behaviors using what we call exposure. So it might be taking them on an imaginative journey. It might be helping them to write. Just anything that helps them to express it. And that's combined with skills training to assist in the distressing symptoms that are happening. So some of these are breathing, relaxation, thought-stopping techniques, and I'll take you into a couple of those in a minute. But it also includes examining a person's beliefs about trauma and the world and how these beliefs influence a survivor's feelings and behaviour. And in terms of that, it's not an approach that's bound by culture. And when in my doctoral research, I found that counsellors really went for these counselling tools, and it helped them to better manage their trauma symptoms and pass the skills on to others in their communities. And here's some of those skills: 4-square breathing, the SUD scale, containment and grounding exercises, flashbacks of dreams and nightmares. So we're just going to go through some of those tools. The first one is 4-square breathing. You can do this anywhere. You can practice it anywhere, and your client can practice it anywhere. It's a breathing tool designed to reduce emotional distress. So a box is drawn to illustrate how to slow down the breath. And counsellors are taught to inhale for 4 seconds, suspend the breath for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds, suspend the breath for 4 seconds, and then repeat the process by moving around the square again. And this will reduce the anxiety and distressive symptoms. Another one I found really helpful is the subjective units of distress scale, or the SUD scale. And it's a method of your client communicating to you how much distress they're currently feeling. So you instruct your counsellors to bring their attention to any distressful emotions or feelings or sensations they're having when you start to talk about a particular topic. And it helps the client to actually listen to what's happening in their body too. So you can start off by asking them, if you were to walk into a darkened room and you were afraid, on a scale of 0 to 10, what level of distress do you think you are experiencing? And when you have a good sense of the distress level, rate your distress from 0 to 10, 0 being nothing really is happening, to 10 being overwhelming. And if it's a very high score, we need to stop talking about that and work on some grounding and emotional containment skills. Excuse me. So it's important to contain and stay grounded in order to be safe. So to be grounded means to be staying in the present instead of spacing out or reliving the trauma. And these are some simple grounding exercises that will bring someone solidly back to the present. So name 5 things that you can see. Name 5 things that you can hear. Let's go back to see. I see a wall. I see a tree. I see a child. I see a chair. I see a clock. I see a door. 5 things I hear: the wind in the trees, people talking and laughing. You get the idea. And then 5 things that I feel. Well, it's rather hot today. The texture of my clothing. I'm just going to feel the chair, my body on the chair, my feet inside my shoes, etc. A really simple one if somebody has gone into their trauma, to bring them back to the present. And then a grounding exercise. Ask the person to press their feet into the ground and describe how that feels. And there's spiritual containment strategies as well. This is called the God Trust Box. So you can write down all your anxiety-inducing problems, your unresolved questions, your worries, and slip them into the Trusting God box. And simply give thanks for God's answer that is not perhaps there yet, but it will come. And then there's the deliberate appreciation exercise. And this helps people build an interactive connection with God. God becomes the client's safe place. So you might ask them to recall a previous experience where you felt very close and connected with God. Spend a few times giving thanks for that and tell him what it is about that time that you really appreciate. And then there's role play. Counsellors would benefit from role plays that express their particular context in their extended family and that address their daily stresses caused by trauma symptoms. And how can they restore their assigned roles in the extended family and the community that preserve social harmony within their communities? So you could role play some of those instances where they're not doing so well and what it might look like to do better. And then there's celebrate your survival. We did this once with Robert, with a group. They wrote down, actually it was about forgiveness, that one, but they celebrated their survival. So all the things that have happened to you since that trauma happened, you celebrate your survival. You've survived. You're still here, and the trauma hasn't got you yet. Then there's dreams, flashbacks, and nightmares. And to go into that would take a long time. So I want to recommend this little book, 8 Keys to Safe Trauma Recovery by Babette Rothschild. And it's written for the survivor. And there's some great stuff in there on how to deal with flashbacks, dreams, and nightmares, because we haven't got time on this recording. The third approach is positive psychological therapy, positive psychology it's called, and it's concerned with building strengths. You concentrate on the client's strengths rather than what's missing and building the best things in life. And it's about building resilience. So I bounce back from adversity. And I found in my, my research that picture cards and drawings were found to be the most powerful resource that helped identify strength, and it also facilitated self-disclosure. So picture cards and drawings are a powerful resource. And one of them is called Photo Language. It's available online, but you can make your own. Just get a whole lot of picture cards of different things in life. And you place them on the ground and you ask your counsellee to walk around them and choose one that symbolises whatever you're talking about. I did this in one group with, I know what trauma means to me, but I want to know what trauma means to you. So walk around and choose a card that represents your trauma. So they could talk about their card. If I asked them to talk about what was happening inside, they wouldn't be able to tell me. So it's a gateway to verbally express their inner feelings and to reveal previously undisclosed parts of themselves. And in this way, it's not bound by culture. And lastly, narrative therapy is about story, and it's about using a metaphor to tell your story. It's designed to assist counsellors in exploring the dominant story that they're living at the moment in terms of their trauma and about their relationships. So the focus of narrative therapy is to help counsellors discover alternate stories where they can create space for change and restory their lives into more affirming and positive stories, beliefs, and attitudes. And one of the best ones I've found is the Tree of Life. You can look online and find this, but it uses the everyday image of a tree as a metaphor for telling the story of a counsellor's life, with each element representing a part of their life. So it can take an entire day to complete and debrief, or you can do it in a few hours. It just depends your time constraints. But it allows people to talk about their lives without becoming re-traumatized. And they're building a relationship with their own history, their culture, and the meaningful people in their lives. And they can explore their values and beliefs that underpin their experiences of trauma and the implications that trauma has had on their sense of meaning and their relationships. And it also helps them to envision a positive future, which they've often lost hope. The trauma has caused them to lose hope. So it allows them to envision another sort of future. And it's very culturally appropriate method of self-reflection. So the roots represent your past, where you come from. And let's go up to the leaves, and the seeds represent people who have been important to you. Yeah, it's really a very effective tool. So we come back to our burning house, and I've given you a bit of a floor plan to get out of the burning house. You've been given tools that help your counsellors to experience safety and to function more effectively in their families. But just remember, whoever provides the therapy is much more important to the success of your therapy than your approach or the tools that you use. So it's up to you to create a safe environment that helps your counsellors to risk sharing their stories and to help them to learn to provide that safety for others in their communities. Thank you for listening. I know I've rushed through this. It's a short time. We could spend a whole 2 hours on every slide, but I hope that's given you a bit of an overview. Thank you for listening. Bye.